The sirens painted the night in red, a steady pulse that matched the tremor in Dr. Ethan Hawley's hands. The rain hammered the hospital bay doors, as if time itself were urging them to open faster. Somewhere beyond the floodlights, a helicopter's blade shredded the air, bringing a life that had been slipping between minutes and breath. The CEO's daughter arrived in a storm of water and light, a pale silhouette on a stretcher, mascara washed into comet trails across her cheeks, a blood-soaked scarf cinched into a makeshift tourniquet on her thigh. Ethan didn't register the cameras trailing the security detail or the murmurs of nurses who recognized the last name. He registered the numbers, the patterns, the fragile arithmetic of survival, systolic pressure dropping like an elevator, narrowed pulse pressure, the cold sheen of shock. He spoke with the calm cadence of someone who has learned to stack poise over panic to large-bore IVs. Norepinephrine free standing by, a liter bolus warm, tranexamic acid, type and cross. Called the OR, but beneath the practiced voice lived the oldest fear. The one that asks whether the body will obey the mind when a stranger's fate climbs into your fingers. They rolled her under the unforgiving bloom of the trauma lights, and the world narrowed to the wound, the blood, the map of damage drawn in red across skin that had been meant for laughter, not sutures. The gash was jagged from a guardrail, the femoral pulse fluttered and threatened silence. Ethan's team moved with the choreography that only pressure can teach. Tourniquet released, packed with hemostatic gauze, handheld Doppler hunting for the arterial whisper. Ultrasound tracing the black river of a hematoma while her breath shallowed like a tide going out. He pressed his palm where technique became prayer, felt warmth spread against his glove, and told the scrub tech to hand him the vascular clamp he trusted more than sleep. The clamp found the vessel, the hemorrhage lost its voice. A meter away, the anesthesiologist tilted her head and announced a number that made the room exhale. "You're going to be okay," Ethan said, and it wasn't a promise a doctor cannot promise but an anchor thrown into rough water. Her eyes, dilation fighting the lights, flicked to him with the fragile courage of the newly broken, and for a heartbeat the room's machinery receded, leaving only two souls negotiating with fate. In the OR, precision replaced chaos, the theater changing sets but not stakes. Air warmed, hands steadied. The damage was mean but not malicious. Bone spared, artery bruised and torn but repairable, muscle lacerated, nerves insulted rather than severed. Ethan's stitch pattern moved like a quiet song as he repaired what steel had tried to erase. He thought of how often a life becomes a headline only after it almost ends, how much attention is bought with suffering, how little any of it matters at the cellular scale where healing is just a decision repeated by millions of cells in the dark. He listened to the monitor's metronome and imagined the patient's future writing on each beat, the first steps after discharge, the first night without nightmares, the first time a scar is seen not as a theft but as a signature. Before closing, he paused to ritual, hands hovering above the field, naming silently the things he could not measure: courage, luck, the kindness of teams, the mercy of minutes. Dawn broke over the recovery unit like a confession, glass turning pearl, rain pausing as if the city itself wanted to watch someone come back. Ethan stood at the foot of her bed with a chart that told the truth but not the story. Numbers trended in the right direction, lactate easing, blood pressure no longer arguing with gravity. She drifted up through anesthesia's soft fog and met him in a quiet too delicate for words. He introduced himself without titles, a small rebellion against the theater of status that often crept into this hospital when powerful families visited. He told her what had happened: car, guardrail, helicopter, repair, stable, and then, because fear hates emptiness, he filled the silence with certainty. Pain control planned, physical therapy scheduled, imaging reassuring. She nodded, and a single tear more saline, less spectacle, escaped the corner of her left eye. He pretended not to see it because medicine is the art of knowing which truths to honor in public. News rippled through the halls in the clumsy way that news does when money is involved. Security stationed themselves like punctuation marks. A publicist asked for talking points before the wound dressing had dried. A CEO, her father, arrived with the scent of jet fuel and the posture of a man who believed the world bent for him, then crumpled when he saw his child sleeping beneath a fluorescent sky. He shook Ethan's hand, too long and too tight, gratitude pouring out in the wrong language, promises of donations, a wing with the doctor's name, access to things that do not matter when someone you love learns to count by pain. Ethan accepted none of it and all of it with a practiced smile, aware that a thank you can be a transaction or a bomb, and only one of those can heal. He thought of his own daughter, 9 years old, who measured love in bedtime stories and pancake breakfasts, and he wondered how many versions of fatherhood are forged at hospital bedsides. The days unfolded with the slow grace of recovery. She learned to stand again with the therapist's hands hovering but not holding. She learned the distance between pain that warns and pain that lies. Ethan watched from the doorway more often than he entered, careful not to tether his worth to one patient's arc, but drawn anyway, as we often are, to the people who cross our lives on the night the rain begs and the sky answers. They spoke rarely and mostly about practicalities, dressings, clots, the good fatigue of healing, but once, just once, she asked him if he ever thought about the strangers he saved after they left. He answered too quickly that he tries not to, because detachment is a shield, but then admitted that some faces linger like the scent of a storm. "You're one of them now," he said. It wasn't romance. It was recognition, the quiet kind that doesn't need a violin score. Discharge came with a reluctance the chart could not record. The hospital released its hold, replaced monitors with appointment dates, replaced alarms with a phone number that always rang at the same human voice. She thanked him with the simple sincerity people use when the grand gesture would feel like theater, and she left in a car that cost more than his house with the slow carefulness of a person carrying a new, precarious hope. Ethan returned to the rhythm of call nights and consults, the anonymous heroism of hand sanitizer and 3 a.m. coffee, and a week later he almost convinced himself she had become another name in the long scroll of memory that a hospital writes in light. Almost because fate has a taste for symmetry. The hospital fundraiser arrived draped in gold napkins and carefully curated causes, a ballroom lit like champagne, the word grateful rehearsed until it lost its edges. Ethan wore the tuxedo he borrowed once a year and the discomfort he wore every day he wasn't in scrubs. He shook hands with donors who spoke fluent benevolence, nodded at administrators who measured compassion in metrics, and searched for the nearest exit with a juvenile longing. Then a hush rolled across the room, not because a speech had begun but because wealth had entered. The CEO stepped into the light, his daughter at his arm in a long silver dress that turned every gaze into a confession. She moved with the caution of healing and the confidence of someone who had learned that fragility and resilience can be sisters. For a second her eyes found Ethan across the room, recognition, warmth, the ghost of that dawn, and the world seemed to contract, bringing him the way a tide brings a shell back to shore. He did not want to interrupt, did not want to mistake private recovery for public relationship, but gratitude deserves to meet gratitude, so he crossed the floor with the same steady breath he used before an incision. He offered a small bow of the head, the quiet smile of a man acknowledging a shared storm, and said her name with the soft respect of someone who has held part of your life inside his hands. She blinked once, twice, and then tilted her chin with a stranger's elegance. Her lips curved into a social smile as brittle as spun sugar. "I'm sorry," she said, voice smooth and amplified by the room's hush. "Have we met?" The sentence landed like a dropped instrument in an operating room, jarring precisely because it should never happen here. Around them, people resumed talking with the sudden vigor of those fleeing awkwardness, and Ethan stood in the center of a ballroom that smelled like roses and philanthropy and felt the old fear rise again, not of losing a patient, but of losing the meaning of saving one. The music at the gala resumed before his pulse did. The applause, the clinking of glasses, the polite laughter, all of it blurred into the dull roar that fills the silence after humiliation. Ethan stood frozen for a breath too long, the crystal light above him turning his stillness into spectacle. He excused himself with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to invisible wounds, making his way through the crowd that had already decided to forget the scene. Outside, the night was quiet again, no rain, no sirens, only the hum of generators and the faint echo of a string quartet leaking through the ballroom doors. He took off his tuxedo jacket, folded it neatly over his arm, and felt the absurd weight of realizing that saving someone's life does not guarantee a place in their story. Some rescues, he thought, and not with gratitude but with erasure. The next morning, the hospital swallowed him whole again. The smell of antiseptic, the glow of monitors, the rhythmic chatter of footsteps, the only constants in a life defined by transience. The board glowed with chaos, trauma bay 2, multi-vehicle accident. Consult in IQ, post-op infection, psych hold waiting for clearance. He slipped back into the choreography of crisis, where the heart has no room for vanity. But her face, the one that had once turned toward him under the rain, kept intruding like an after-image burned into his eyelids. Between cases, between signatures, between breaths, she was there, not as a wound but as a question. What makes someone deny the person who saved them? The answer came indirectly, as most truths do in hospitals, whispered between rounds, carried in half-truths and gossip. A nurse mentioned a donor's daughter preparing for a public appearance, a scandal being managed, a reputation rebuilt. A crash had been blamed on a driver, not her. Liability, image, shareholders, words that meant nothing beside a beating heart, but meant everything once lawyers got involved. Ethan realized then that pretending not to know him had not been cruelty, but calculus. To acknowledge the doctor who saved her would be to admit weakness, to expose the chaos behind perfection. In her world, gratitude was private, survival was branding. That night, his daughter, Lily, asked him during dinner why he looked like the sky before a storm. He smiled, the kind that hides exhaustion behind affection, and said, "Sometimes grown-ups remember things we shouldn't keep remembering." She nodded solemnly, chewing her pasta, then offered him the last meatball because that's what love looks like when it doesn't need words. Later, when she fell asleep, he stood by her doorway and thought of the CEO's daughter again, of how the people can share the most fragile, intimate moment imaginable and still live on opposite sides of truth. Maybe that was the quiet cruelty of the world. Some connections survive blood loss, others die of silence. Days passed, measured in heartbeats, case notes, and caffeine. Then, one evening, as the sky bruised itself into twilight, Ethan was called to the private wing. A post-surgical patient had requested him personally. The name on the chart stopped him cold. Eileen Mercer, her. His hand hesitated before pushing the door open, as though crossing into a memory might rewrite it. Inside, she sat upright in bed, no glamour, no silver dress, just a hospital gown and the vulnerability of someone who had run out of masks. She didn't look away this time. "Dr. Hale," she said softly, the name trembling between apology and relief. "I owe you more than I can say." He wanted to speak, to ask why, to demand, to forgive, but the voice of habit came first. "How's the pain?" he asked, because doctors ask about pain even when they're drowning in it themselves. She smiled faintly, a trace of the woman from that night under the rain. "Better now," she whispered. "At least the kind you can measure." The room was steeped in the quiet hum of machines, their soft beeping marking the seconds of an uneasy truce. Ethan stood by the foot of the bed, his posture professional, but his pulse betrayed him, faster than protocol allowed, slower than forgiveness deserved. Alina avoided his eyes for a moment, studying the rhythm of the floor drip as if searching for courage inside its sterile precision. The air between them was heavy with words unsaid, the kind that linger longer than painkillers. "I didn't expect you'd agree to see me," she said finally, her voice low, stripped of the certainty that had once built empires. "You saved me, and she paused, the sentence fracturing under its own weight. "I made you a ghost to protect myself." Ethan's expression didn't shift, but something in his shoulders loosened, the quiet ache of someone who's heard the truth, even if too late. "You didn't owe me anything," he said, though both knew that wasn't true. She looked up, eyes rimmed with the fragile honesty that only comes after shame. "I did," she whispered. "You gave me back my life, and I turned you into a liability. My father said the press couldn't know I was driving. He said the company couldn't afford another scandal. I was cowardly enough to agree." She stopped, a tear cutting through the carefully applied restraint. "You deserved more than silence." He exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if releasing years of tension through one controlled breath. "In my world," he said, "people die because someone's 2 minutes late. I don't have the luxury of holding grudges." The words were kind, but the tone carried a trace of the loneliness he had perfected over years of saving strangers. Alina studied him like she was seeing him for the first time, not as the surgeon who stitched her back to life, but as a man who had built walls made of duty and called them boundaries. "Then let me thank you," she murmured, almost pleading. "Not in front of cameras or crowds, just me." He nodded once, unsure whether it was acceptance or surrender. She reached out, tentative, trembling, and he took her hand, surprised by how warm it was. Her pulse fluttered against his palm, alive, deliberate. In that small, fragile contact, every detail from that night, the rain, the lights, the blood, replayed in silence. "You don't have to be sorry," he said finally. "You just have to be well." But her eyes told him she wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for something else, a chance to rewrite the moment she chose fear over truth. When he left her room, the corridor felt different. The usual scent of disinfectant gave way to something almost human, almost hope. He passed a nurse, offered a quiet nod, and stepped into the empty elevator. The metallic doors closed on his reflection, eyes tired, jaw set, a man suspended between healing others and forgetting himself. As the elevator hummed downward, his mind replayed her words, "You made me a ghost to protect myself." It echoed in him, not as bitterness, but as recognition. Everyone, in some way, chooses what parts of themselves the world is allowed to see. Outside, night had descended again. The hospital lights glowed like constellations against the dark, and Ethan realized the city never truly slept, it just changed its kind of suffering. He walked to his car, rain starting to fall in cautious drops, the smell of ozone sharp and familiar. Somewhere above the noise of engines and rain, he thought he heard her voice, not the apology, but the breath that came after it, the sound of someone remembering how to live. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of half-silence and small recognitions. Alina remained in the private ward, not as the untouchable heiress the tabloids worshipped, but as a woman rediscovering her own fragility. Ethan visited her under the pretext of post-op evaluations, though both knew the conversation stretched far beyond the chart. She asked about recovery milestones, nerve sensitivity, scarring, mobility, but her eyes always lingered too long on his hands, as if trying to remember the night they stitched her fate back together. Their dialogues grew into soft rituals, a question, a pause, a half-smile shared like a secret the world couldn't eavesdrop on. Outside the hospital, headlines spun a cleaner version of her story. CEO's daughter miraculously recovers after tragic accident. No mention of who caught the miracle as it fell. The photograph that accompanied the article showed her in a sunlit rehabilitation center, smiling faintly beside her father. Ethan saw it once in the cafeteria and turned the page before finishing his coffee. He wasn't angry, just reminded that in the theater of reputation, truth rarely gets a speaking role. Still, every time her follow-up appeared on his schedule, he caught himself adjusting his tie, combing his hair with the precision of a man who doesn't want to admit he's waiting for someone. One evening, after the last consult, he found her sitting by the panoramic window overlooking the city, a skyline pulsing with distant sirens and the soft orange glow of the setting sun. She looked stronger now, a slight limp the only visible reminder of that night. "I've been thinking," she said without turning, "about what happens when we survive the wrong way." Ethan leaned against the railing beside her, unsure if she wanted a doctor or a witness. "The wrong way," he echoed. "When you survive, but you lose the part of yourself that knew how to be honest," she murmured. "When you heal, but not where it matters." The sunset painted her face in streaks of gold and sorrow. He understood, not because he had lived her life, but because every doctor has known what it's like to fix the body and fail the soul. He told her a story then, not a confession, but close enough. "A patient once told me recovery isn't about becoming who you were. It's about learning who survived." She looked at him, really looked, and the air changed. "Then who are you, Dr. Hale?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then smiled with a weary honesty. "Someone who doesn't know how to stop saving people, even when they don't ask to be saved." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, as if the hospital walls themselves leaned closer to listen. Alina turned back to the city lights, her reflection merging with his in the glass. "Maybe that's why you were there that night," she whispered. "Not just to save me, but to remind me what mercy looks like." For a fleeting moment, their hands touched on the cold metal railing, not by accident, but by surrender. The city outside blurred into a halo of color, and somewhere in the quiet, something unnamed began to grow, not romance, not redemption, but the fragile understanding that sometimes the heart finds connection not through love, but through the recognition of pain shared and survived. When Ethan left that night, the air smelled of coming rain again. He looked once over his shoulder. She was still there, framed by light, breathing proof of every decision that had nearly broken him. And for the first time since the storm, he felt something close to peace. The rain returned 2 nights later, as if the sky itself remembered them. It began softly, A whisper against the hospital's glass walls then grew heavier, rhythmic, insistent, the same song that had once carried her life through the outdoors. Ethan stood by the nurse's station finishing his final chart when he noticed her name again on the board. Eileen Mercer, room 912, observation. She wasn't supposed to be back. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with that quiet alertness that only forms when fate circles back too soon. When he reached her room, she was standing by the window again, barefoot, her fur disconnected. The city glowed beneath her, thousands of lights pulsing like heartbeats in the dark. She turned when she heard him enter, her hair loose, her hospital gown replaced by a simple gray sweater that made her seem almost ordinary. "They said you checked out 2 days ago," he said, voice low. She smiled, a small, tired curve. "I did, but I didn't know where else to go." Her honesty disarmed him in a way wounds never could. "Everywhere feels too loud now," she continued. "Too many people pretending not to bleed." He closed the door quietly and stood beside her. The rain outside deepened, the rhythmic percussion filling the silence between them. "Hospitals are strange that way," he said. "They teach you to live with ghosts. Some stay longer than they should." She nodded. "And you?" she asked. "Do you ever stop hearing them?" He almost smiled. "No. You just learned their names." For a moment, neither spoke. The city blurred beneath raindrops, the world distilled into reflection, to silhouettes on glass, both healed and haunted. She broke the silence first. "My father doesn't understand why I'm not celebrating," she confessed. "The company's stock went up, the PR campaign worked. I'm supposed to feel grateful, but I don't feel real." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with recognition, the kind of truth that refuses to be buried under luxury. Ethan turned to face her. "Real doesn't always mean happy," he said quietly. "It just means you stopped lying to yourself." Her eyes met his, searching for permission to unravel. "And you?" she asked. "Do you ever stop pretending you're fine?" The question struck deeper than she intended. He didn't answer, not because he couldn't, but because some truths are easier to share through silence. She stepped closer then, slow, deliberate, until he could see his reflection in her eyes. "That night," she whispered, "you looked at me like I was still worth saving." No one had looked at me like that in years. He inhaled, the air thick with rain and memory. "You were worth saving," he said simply. "You still are." Her breath caught, as if the words had found a wound she hadn't realized was still open. They stood that way, unmoving, as thunder rolled softly across the city, not lovers, not strangers, just two broken equations trying to balance the unspoken. The monitor by her bed blinked once, the only sound in the room besides the storm. She looked toward it, then back at him, voice barely audible. "Do you ever wish you hadn't saved someone?" He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "No," he said. "But I've wished I could save them twice." Something in her broke at that, quietly, completely. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest, not seeking romance but refuge. He let her stay there, his hand hovering for a moment before finally settling against her back. The rain outside softened, and for the first time, she didn't flinch from its sound. They stayed like that, motionless, suspended between regret and renewal, until the lights flickered once, and she whispered, "Maybe surviving wasn't the miracle. Maybe meeting you was." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence is the only language that doesn't betray the truth. The night folded around them like a quiet secret. When the storm finally gave way, only the sound of distant thunder remained, a low heartbeat echoing through the glass walls of the hospital. Alina had drifted to sleep in the chair by the window, her head resting lightly on her arm. Ethan stayed a while longer, sitting beside her, watching as the city lights dimmed and dawn began to rise over the skyline. There was a peace in that moment that didn't belong to either of them, the kind that comes only after surviving something you can't explain to anyone else. He thought of how fragile it all was, the boundary between duty and feeling, between saving someone and wanting to stay after they're saved. In medicine, distance is a shield. Compassion without control can break a doctor faster than exhaustion ever will. And yet, as he watched her chest rise and fall, he realized that whatever wall he had built around himself had already cracked the night she pretended not to know him. The hurt had been personal, yes, but now he understood it wasn't betrayal, it was fear. And fear, he knew too well, makes strangers of those who once shared a heartbeat. When she woke, the morning light painted her face in soft gold, and for a second she looked untouched by everything that had happened. "You stayed," she said, voice heavy with sleep. "Doctors don't usually do that." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I forgot to clock out." Her lips curved into a small laugh, quiet but real. "You should teach my father that kind of loyalty," she said, half joking, half sincere. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and poured her a glass of water. "Drink," he said softly. "Your body's still catching up with your soul." She obeyed, her eyes never leaving him. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night?" He nodded slowly. "All the time," he admitted. "But then I remember, if it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else. The world keeps spinning, with or without us." She tilted her head. "That's what I thought too. Until I met you." The sentence fell between them like a confession wrapped in grace, neither an invitation nor a boundary, just truth said out loud. Ethan felt the air change, not heavier, just more aware. He took a step back, instinctively reaching for professionalism like armor. "You should rest," he said, tone gentler than distance should allow, but she caught the hesitation in his eyes. "You always say that when you want to leave," she murmured. He froze for a moment. "And you always ask me to stay when you're afraid to be alone." They both smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. He turned toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. "You'll be discharged tomorrow," he said. "Your leg's healing beautifully. The rest will take longer." She watched him in silence, as if memorizing his silhouette. "Then I guess I'll have to come up with excuses to visit," she said quietly. He paused, back still turned to her. "You won't need excuses," he replied, "just honesty." When the door closed behind him, Alina looked at the empty space he left and realized the hospital no longer felt sterile. It felt alive, like a place that remembered. She touched the faint scar on her thigh, not with sadness, but with something close to reverence. Some wounds, she thought, aren't meant to disappear. They're meant to remind you who found you in the dark. Weeks passed. The hospital halls forgot her name, as they always do, replacing it with new emergencies, new faces, new stories waiting to be saved. Ethan returned to his rhythm, rounds, surgeries, late nights that blurred into mornings. Yet, even in the monotony, there were moments when memory whispered her name. It came with the rain sometimes, or when he passed the window where she had once watched the city breathe. He would pause there without meaning to, his reflection merging with hers in some ghostly overlap of time. Healing, he realized, wasn't a line. It was a loop, one that kept bringing her back in the quiet ways absence does. Then, one morning, a letter arrived at the nurse's station. It wasn't electronic, a real envelope, handwritten, with his name in ink too careful to be casual. He opened it between patient charts, and the first line made his throat tighten. "You once told me that real doesn't mean happy. It means you stopped lying to yourself. I think I finally have." It was from Alina. No signature of a PR team, no stationery with her family's logo, just her words, raw and clean. She wrote about leaving her father's company, about moving somewhere smaller, quieter, about wanting to live a life that didn't require pretending. "You saved more than my life that night," the letter said. "You saved the part of me that still believed in second chances." He folded it carefully, as if it were something fragile enough to bleed, and placed it inside his coat pocket. That evening, he drove home through a drizzle that reminded him of that first night, the rain softer now, more forgiving. When he arrived, his daughter Lily ran to the door barefoot, clutching her sketchbook. "I drew your hospital, Daddy," she said proudly, showing him a page filled with color. There was a little figure in blue standing beside a bright red ambulance, and next to him, a woman in a silver dress with the sun drawn above her head. "Who's that?" he asked gently. Lily shrugged. "I don't know, but she looks happy you helped her." He smiled, that quiet, aching kind of smile that only happens when life gives you poetry instead of closure. Later, after she fell asleep, he stood by the window, the letter in his hand, the city stretching wide beneath him. Somewhere out there, Alina was beginning again. Maybe she'd walk by a small hospital someday and remember not the man who saved her, but the night that rewrote her. He didn't need more than that. He didn't need to see her again to know she had survived the right way this time. As the rain eased, Ethan opened the window slightly, letting the cool air fill the room. He whispered to no one, "Be well, Alina," and the words felt like release. The letter wrestled gently on the desk beside him, like catching the last sentence she had written. Some people save you once. Others keep saving you every time you remember them. He read it twice, then looked out toward the dawn breaking over the same city that had once tried to take her, now carrying her somewhere new. In the faint glow of morning, Ethan realized that not all goodbyes mean endings. Some simply mean that the story survived. Months later, the hospital's rhythm pulsed as it always had, machines breathing in metallic sync, footsteps echoing like a constant heartbeat through white corridors. Ethan had learned to live between moments again, measuring his days not by what he lost, but by what he gave. Yet sometimes, in the small pauses between surgeries, he would catch a memory like light through a cracked door, the rain, the silver dress, the hand that trembled but refused to let go. It wasn't longing anymore. It was gratitude, quiet and complete. He didn't hear from her again, not directly. But one morning, as he prepared for rounds, the head nurse placed a small brown parcel on his desk. No sender's name, only a note that read, "For the doctor who taught me that healing isn't just survival." Inside, there was a framed photograph, a quiet coastal town, waves brushing the shore beneath a cloudy sky. And standing at the edge of the pier, turned away from the camera, was a woman in a long white dress, her hair dancing in the wind. She wasn't posing, she was living. Beneath the photo, a line written in the same handwriting as her letter. "I found peace where no one knows my name." Ethan stared at it for a long time before placing it on the shelf above his desk, between his medical textbooks and his daughter's drawings. It looked out of place there, too human, too free, and yet, somehow, it belonged more than anything else. He touched the frame once, not as a goodbye but as a benediction. In his chest, something uncoiled, slow and tender, the understanding that love doesn't always arrive to stay. Sometimes it arrives just to change what you believe possible. That evening, when he walked Lily home from school, she asked him why he smiled at the rain. He told her, "Because it means someone I once knew is probably smiling too." She laughed and skipped ahead, her umbrella spinning like a small planet of its own. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of what had been left unsaid, only the lightness of what had survived. Back home, as the city slipped into night, Ethan opened his window again. The air was cool, clean, and carried the faint scent of sea salt, as if the world itself had decided to send him a whisper from wherever she was. He leaned against the frame, listening to the rhythm of rain beginning once more, soft, forgiving, endless. In that sound, he heard everything that had mattered, a promise, a silence, a life reclaimed. He closed his eyes and let the world breathe around him. And somewhere between memory and mercy, he finally understood, some stories don't end when people part. They end when both hearts, in their own ways, learn to rest. The city lights flickered against the storm, and Dr. Ethan Hale smiled, not at what was lost, but at what was found. A reason to keep saving, even when no one is watching.